Jocko. Dear Jocko, my chosen community has lost and continues to lose members due to suicide. One reason is that they don't ask for help. I think one reason they don't ask for help is that they're afraid of being seen as weak. I'm aware that this takes strength and discipline to be able to perceive when you need help and to ask for it. I don't know how to convey that to them. Could you address how one can gather support from their team without losing face?
So there's an obvious reason why I paired these two questions together, because they're both very, very similar, and it's the same thing. And if a member of your team won't come forward and admit they have an issue, then the issue is not going to get addressed. And this is the same exact thing that you have to explain to your team. Like, hey, if you start going down because you're dehydrated, or you start getting frostbite and you need to get warmed up, you need to say something. If you don't say something, that's going to hurt the whole team. That's what's bad. So I think that's important. I think that's important to make sure everyone understands that this part of being a good operator is knowing your limitations, and when you reach your limitations, raising your hand and saying, hey, this is a problem. And believe me, there's guys that might complain about little things, and they're eventually going to be labeled as a little complainer, right? And they don't really have issues. So there's a fine line, right? There's a fine line. But for this one, for someone that's having some kind of mental stress, well, again, we got to recognize what's going on. We got to recognize that it's impacting us negatively at work. So that means you got to raise your hand. If it's having a negative impact on the way you're performing, then you got to raise your hand. And I think it's important to explain to people that this is something that can happen to anybody. And it's not a negative thing. It's just a reality. It's kind of like, it reminds me of being afraid, right? And if you're, let's say you got a new guy that's never done anything before, and he doesn't know that he's going to be afraid going on an operation, then he's going to wonder why his stomach is upset or why he's second-guessing himself, or why he can't sleep. Like, oh, you can't sleep. Guess what? That's normal. You're going on a hardcore combat operation tomorrow. The fact that you can't sleep is completely normal. The fact that you feel sick to your stomach is completely normal. The fact that you're shaking, those things are normal. Like, you're going to feel those. That's okay. It's not that big of a deal. And those things are just fear. That's what they are. And if you know what they are, and you know that fear is okay and it's acceptable and it's actually kind of good, right? Because if you're not feeling any fear whatsoever, then you've got some. Well, you should be feeling afraid. You should feel fear. That should propel you. It should get you on edge. All those things are actually happening for a reason. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's the same thing that you got to explain to people with stress. Like, oh, okay, that you can have too much fear. You keep someone at that heightened state for an extended period of time. Well, that's called combat stress, and it's real, and it can happen. It can happen to anyone. And how many books have we talked about on this podcast where you can see combat stress taking its toll on people? And when it does, we've talked about it many times. If you get to that point, you need a break. And Dick Winters from Band of Brothers, he would give those guys breaks without them even knowing that he was giving them a break. He'd say, oh, hey, Echo, you got to go back and do a little logistics run for 4 days. Just make sure we have more supplies coming our way. Get you off the front line, get you a breather. So that way, again, the same metaphor I've used before is, if you have an engine in the red and you keep running it, what's going to happen to the engine? It's going to burn out. It's not going to be usable. If you have someone that's psychologically stressed and they're in the red and you keep running them in the red, guess what? Eventually they're not going to be usable anymore. Mm-hmm. So you need to give them a break, get them off the line. Because if you do take an engine, if your check engine light comes on and you go and get it maintained, get it fixed, the engine's still good. If you keep running it, the engine will be destroyed. So you got to do that with your people, and you got to make sure everybody knows. And I think that's a real simple metaphor to use with people as well. Say, look, we're running hard, and we're going to put some stress on the engine. And if you don't keep the engine maintained, the engine's going to break, and you won't be any good to the team. You won't be any good for the mission. So if you start feeling your engine light go on, you got to let someone know so we can give you the proper maintenance. And that's it. Jody Minnick talked about that too. Jody was, saying, hey, basically, if you get injured, if you break your ankle, they don't just expect you just to keep going. No,
Yeah.
like, okay, you need to get back and you need to do rehab. Well, the same thing can happen to your brain. Your brain gets a break in it. You don't just keep driving her. It's going to fracture and fall apart.
Yep.
What do? You take a break, you get downtime, and you get recovered, and then you'll be ready to rock and roll again.
Yep.
So two really good questions to start it off. Again, especially for folks out there on the battlefield, and it's not just for people on the battlefield, because it happens with any group of people that are in a stressful environment. I mean, obviously, cops get put into a really stressful environment all the time. Well, if you need to take a breather, you need to say something before you burn out the engine.
Yeah.
Same thing with business world, right? People in the business world get extremely stressed out. Well, you probably need a break at some point.
Yeah.
Make sure you work that in there.